So it seems like every athlete nowadays have a podcast. We have guys like Travis Kelce and his brother Jason Kelce. We have the Amon-Ra St. Brown brothers, Micah, Parsons, and then a whole lot of basketball podcasts. With the boom in athletes and podcasts also comes the criticism of the fact that these guys are doing things outside of what they're being paid for. For some reason, we as fans think that whenever an athlete takes a break from actually playing the one thing that it was supposed to do their entire lives, that's a problem. And don't get me wrong, I understand the sentiment and why people hate a guy like Paul George being a podcaster. Like, you can't be a podcaster if you aren't doing good on the field. But all this fuzz about the athletes in the podcasting world and the athletes in media has led to a whole lot of problems. There's a whole movement going on right now where you're either on the side of the athletes or on the side of the media. You either want athletes to be free and expressive of their own feelings and of their own narratives, or you think athletes are caring about fame way too much and not doing the jobs they're being paid millions of dollars to do. All of that is understandable. But before I talk about that and the reasons people are against this whole podcast thing, I want to first take a look at how the space was back in the day. We have to realize, guys, that before podcasts, athletes literally had zero control over their own stories, and the only way that players could actually talk to the public was through post-game interviews, press conferences. And the problem with that is that the media will actively go in there and edit things out and make the player look a certain way. They had control over the way fans saw a player, and that was obviously a problem when you start painting players in a bad light. If a player was misquoted or taken out of context, there was really no direct way of actively going against the media. There was no way at all you can really just stand for yourself and show the world who you are as a human being. But guys, all of that changed with the advent of social media. Now we have a way of actually seeing who the players were. We have Twitter, we have YouTube, we have Instagram. All of these give us access to the athletes, and they give the athletes ways of actually showing who they are to the world and connecting with their fans in a more direct way. Which, guys, I honestly like. I love that. I want to see these players that we support every day, that you pay your money to go to the stadium for, actually express themselves and be free enough to do that. All right, now let's talk about why people hate athletes that have podcasts. I think it's very important to go over that first because it will get you guys a good understanding as to why I actually even made this video. Now, the big critique with these athletes podcasts is the fact that a lot of people think it's a distraction from the actual sport. Apparently, when we have a guy like Micah Parsons going out there doing a podcast, having fun, doing something productive in his free time, we see that as a distraction. People actually see that and say that's the reason the Cowboys aren't winning the Super Bowl.
Hell no. No.
Like, that absolutely makes no sense to me. We have to understand that these people are people as well. Having a podcast and having the need and the desire to be a part of the media can be a part of an athlete as well. Like, guys, look at me right now. I like talking in front of the camera. I like yapping on the mic a little too much. But even if I become a professional athlete, do y'all think I want to stop doing what I like to do? And I see players like Micah Parsons in that same light. Yes, these guys are extremely great athletes, but they also have other hobbies. It's not fair to take that away from them just because they're athletes. I don't even think these guys actually having a podcast is a way for them to make money. It's just a hobby that they like, and they want to be a part of the media. They like talking. They like having a presence. They like people knowing them outside of football. So that's why I don't see the issue with them taking it out of football and even out of basketball and bringing it on the podcast stage. These guys are competitors, and the podcast world is a whole nother competition for them. That's why I like a guy like Micah Parsons doing his podcast. I love a guy like Travis Kelce and his brothers coming together doing their own podcast. There's just something great about athletes podcasts that fans love, and it gets a lot better if the athletes is actually retired, because that's where this issue is coming from. This distraction issue is usually because the player is actively playing. But we can't just look at a guy like Paul George who happens to have a podcast and is also atrocious at his sport currently. We can't use that as a way to say podcasts are the issue. A player can be bad at basketball, a player can be bad at football, but also have a podcast. The podcast isn't the cause of it just because it's in relation to to them being bad. That is just all I'm saying with this argument that they have against podcasts. Now, another huge issue that people have with this podcast thing is the fact that players don't critique each other enough. Apparently, players don't have the balls to call each other out. And guys, I'm gonna be honest, I wish they do that a lot more often, but I don't even see this as an argument. Like, these players have the right to say what they want to say, and if they don't want to go off on their fellow players, I don't blame them. The media is gonna do that for them anyways, okay? And one of the dumbest argument I've heard from the media about this is the fact that it's getting very oversaturated. Apparently, there are too many player podcasts, and yes, I understand that, but I don't think that's the athlete's fault. I think the podcast world would be oversaturated either way. Do you guys not think that one day DeeTalk's gonna have a podcast? I'm just saying, all right? Like, if I have the clout, if I've given enough value to y'all, I will probably have a podcast one day. The barrier to entry is very low, but that's what makes it so competitive. And I don't blame these guys for going out there and saturating the place and making it more competitive so we get the best value podcast out of them all. These guys ain't going nowhere if the podcasts were ass. I know this. I do YouTube. I understand this shit, boy. So now, guys, knowing all that, let's talk about the question that actually matters. The question that actually has to be asked is, why would a player that's making millions of dollars, why would you go and do a podcast? Now, the number one reason why a player would choose to have a podcast, even though they're already filthy rich, is because of the fact that they get to control that narrative about themselves. Is because of the fact that the media heavy world that we live in today can be very detrimental to an athlete if they don't go out there and speak for themselves. Having that ability to go out there and speak directly to your fans is extremely important. When we just look at the Travis Kelce situation and his whole retirement, if he didn't have a podcast or just a way to actually communicate what he was gonna do, there are gonna be a whole lot of clickbait videos saying Travis Kelce life has changed. This is gonna change Travis Kelce's career forever. We all know the clickbait. So that is why it's very important that he has this platform where he can actually communicate with people and tell them the truth and be a person, be an individual, something that we as sports fans are just adapting to. You have to realize there are people too, man. They're freaking people. Now, another huge reason for why an athlete would have a podcast is pretty simple, okay? Is money. Athletes having podcasts is a way to keep themselves in the media, is the way to keep themselves relevant, and this is gonna lead to a lot of sponsorships. This is gonna give them a lot more opportunities after they retire. It's basically a retirement plan for these guys. You gotta understand, not everybody is a quarterback. We have running backs out here that are being extremely underpaid. There are a lot of positions in sports where players would actually go broke like maybe a decade after retiring. So you have a podcast there that could keep you going for as long as you want. That can literally build you generational wealth. So this is why at the end of the day, I think podcast guys are extremely important for this new shift we're seeing. I want athletes to have the ability to speak their mind. I want them to connect to fans directly because that helps all of us. It helps us as fans understand what these players are going through. It helps us as content creators actually create content that is informed about these players, about these people that we talk about. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments, my boy. Peace out. Bye bye. Mwah.